Welcome to another deep dive. If you're tuning in right now, I'm going to bet that you're an IB history student.
Gearing up for exams, most likely.
Exactly. And you are getting ready to master one of the most dynamic, really head-spinning periods of the 20th century.
It's a massive topic.
It really is. Today, we're analyzing a seriously rich stack of source material covering the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe.
Specifically between 1989 and 1990.
Right. And our mission here is to give you that analytical edge you need for those IB exams. We're going to break down the how and the why behind this. I mean, it's a massive geopolitical earthquake.
We'll be critically examining the primary sources you're likely to encounter, too.
Yeah, and spotting the crucial patterns that tie all these events together. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we start?
Well, the fundamental premise we need to establish from our sources is that the collapse of communism wasn't just one single uniform event.
Right. The Iron Curtain didn't just drop all at once everywhere.
Exactly. It was this complex domino effect. And the historical record categorizes this into three main paths.
Which are crucial to differentiate.
Very. First, we have the negotiated revolutions.
That's Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria.
Yep. Second, the compelled revolutions. So that's the GDR, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Albania.
And finally, the third path.
The tragic nationalist fragmentation in Yugoslavia.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, though, before we even begin to look at those individual countries and their distinct paths, we really have to examine the primary catalyst.
The man who changed the rules.
Mikhail Gorbachev. When he took power in the Soviet Union, he fundamentally altered the geopolitical chessboard.
Because he realized the system was bankrupting itself. Right?
Precisely. He recognized that the Soviet economy was just stagnating. It was heavily burdened by these incredibly costly foreign interventions.
Places like Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, various African nations. So he decisively shifted Soviet foreign policy away from military expansion.
And he refocused on European political cooperation.
Right. He hoped to safeguard Soviet security through negotiation and diplomacy, rather than just relying on brute force.
Which brings us straight to an incredibly important primary document from our stack. This is labeled Source L.
The 1988 speech.
Yes, his speech to the Council of Europe on July 6, 1988. I'm actually going to read the core quote here because understanding this rhetorical shift is, well, it's absolutely essential.
Go for it.
He states, "The philosophy of the concept of a common European home here rules out the possibility of an armed clash, all possibility of an armed clash, and the very possibility of the use of force, above all military force by an alliance against another alliance, inside alliance or whatever it might be."
This raises an important question, and it's exactly the kind of analytical angle an IB student needs to take.
How did this speech actually change the reality on the ground?
Exactly, for the satellite states. Because what Gorbachev is doing here in Sourcell is effectively and publicly dismissing the Brezhnev Doctrine.
And the Brezhnev Doctrine had been the rule for decades.
It was the looming existential shadow over Eastern Europe. It essentially stated that if any communist state tried to stray from the Soviet path, the USSR claimed the absolute right to use military force to bring them back into line.
Wait, so the threat was literal Soviet tanks rolling down the streets of your capital?
Literally, we saw exactly that happen in Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring in 1968.
So that memory was fresh.
Very fresh. The threat of the Red Army was the ultimate deterrent. It kept Eastern Bloc populations and their local governments in check.
And by removing that threat,
Gorbachev inadvertently gave the green light for economic and political liberalization.
even if he didn't mean to go that far.
Right. To be clear on his intentions, he initially just wanted reformed, modernized communist parties to stay in power.
Like a softer version of the same system.
Exactly. He absolutely did not intend to trigger a complete loss of Soviet control over the region.
Let's actually pause and think about the psychology of that for a moment. Put yourself in the shoes of an opposition organizer in Eastern Europe in, say, early 1989.
It's a terrifying position.
For your entire life, the ultimate consequence of rebelling wasn't just dealing with your local police force or your local government,
It was the sheer, overwhelming might of the Soviet military.
which is a psychological barrier that is almost impossible to overcome.
But the moment you realize Gorbachev means what he says in Source L,
That the tanks are explicitly not coming.
the entire calculus of rebellion changes. It completely removes the ceiling on what popular pressure can actually achieve.
It changes everything. And I think that brings us to the first distinct path of collapse, which is the negotiated revolutions.
Let's start with Poland.
Yeah, their situation really highlights the economic breaking point that was just sweeping the whole bloc.
Looking at Poland's situation in the late 1980s, they were increasingly and unsustainably indebted to the West.
The economic reality was dire.
So dire that the ruling leader, General Jaruzelski, was forced to introduce massive price hikes in 1988.
We're talking about everyday goods jumping by up to 200%.
Just imagine the cost of your weekly groceries tripling practically overnight.
Which puts the ruling government in an impossible bind. You combine that severe economic shock with deep systemic corruption.
And you spark a massive wave of nationwide strikes.
Exactly. So the government basically had two choices. They could try to suppress the strikes, which would completely paralyze whatever was left of their economy.
Or they could come to the table.
And they chose the latter.
They did. They finally legalized the independent trade union Solidarity.
Which they had spent years trying to crush.
Right. And they entered into the famous Roundtable Agreements in April 1989.
This is such a fascinating political compromise. Solidarity was officially recognized not just as a labor union, but as a legitimate political party.
And they drafted a new constitution with a very specific power-sharing formula.
Let's slow down and look at the actual numbers they agreed to, because the math here is crucial for understanding the transition.
It really is.
They agreed that in the lower house of parliament, the Sem Solidarity could compete for 35% of the seats.
While 65% was legally reserved for the communists.
Right. It was designed as a safety net for the regime.
They thought retaining 65% of the lower house guaranteed their survival.
But the catch was the newly created upper house, the Senate. Those seats would be decided in entirely free, contested elections.
And the results of those June 1989 elections were absolutely staggering.
Solidarity won 92 out of the 100 available seats in the upper house.
Almost a clean sweep.
And in the lower house, of the 35% they were allowed to contest, they won 160 out of 161 available seats.
It was a total electoral wipeout. The public rejection of the Communist Party was so mathematically undeniable that their political legitimacy just vanished overnight.
Poof, gone.
By August 1989, Solidarity was leading a coalition government, and the Communists were reduced to holding just 4 ministerial positions.
It was a bloodless, negotiated transfer of power driven by a popular vote.
A remarkable shift.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's look at how Hungary handled a similar economic crisis.
Their approach was unique.
From the 1960s onward, their leader, János Kadar, had implemented a system often called goulash communism.
He allowed minor capitalist enterprises to exist.
Yeah, and tolerated some mild social freedoms, as long as nobody openly questioned the party's ultimate authority.
But by 1987, the bill for that artificial stability came due.
Hungary had accumulated the highest per capita Western debt in Eastern Europe. Living standards were dropping rapidly.
And corruption was systemic. Recognizing the danger, the Hungarian party attempted a preemptive strike.
They ousted Kadar.
And replaced him with Károly Gross, who was seen as a committed reformer.
And our materials include a remarkable primary document on this source, Sam.
Yes, it's a memorandum of a private conversation between Gross and Gorbachev from March 1989.
Gross is basically laying out his strategy.
He's essentially arguing that the party needs to retain political power by initiating and leading the democratic reforms themselves.
Specifically to avoid the kind of armed conflict or total economic collapse they were seeing elsewhere.
It's the classic political maneuver of trying to control the narrative.
They believed that if they hosted their own roundtable talks and embraced a multi-party system on their own terms, the public would reward them for it.
But Gorbachev's response in Source M is telling. He agrees that democratic reform is necessary, but he firmly insists that the ultimate limit must be the safekeeping of socialism.
It's an attempt to ride the tiger to avoid being eaten by it.
Exactly. The Hungarian party goes so far as to completely rebrand themselves into a Western-style social democratic party.
But the historical irony here is profound.
It really is. Despite initiating the reforms and changing their name, when the free parliamentary elections finally took place in March 1990.
The newly rebranded Hungarian Socialist Party won less than 11% of the popular vote.
They tried to manage the revolution, and the public simply utilized the new democratic machinery to vote them out of existence.
That is a stunning miscalculation of public sentiment. And rounding out this negotiated category is Bulgaria, which represents a slightly different flavor of negotiation.
Essentially an internal party coup.
Right. You had Todor Zivkov, who had ruled the country with an iron fist for 35 years. By the late 80s, his regime had become a bizarre caricature of cronyism.
He was actively alienating his own party elite through radical administrative reshuffling.
while simultaneously handing out top government jobs to his entirely unqualified family members.
He even set up exclusive stores stocked with Western luxury goods solely for his inner circle.
And beyond the domestic corruption, Zivkov sparked a massive international crisis.
Yes, by launching a highly aggressive assimilation program that resulted in the forced expulsion of roughly 200,000 ethnic Turks from Bulgaria.
The international condemnation for that was swift and severe.
So, seeing the regime becoming globally isolated and domestically despised, his own foreign minister, Pyotr Mladenov, quietly flew to Moscow in July 1989.
He secured Gorbachev's tacit blessing for a leadership change.
And by November, the party forced Zivkov to resign.
So, synthesizing these three, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, the defining characteristic is that the ruling communists themselves formally agreed to, or initiated, the transitional mechanisms.
Largely before the Berlin Wall even fell.
Right. They saw the looming economic catastrophe and negotiated to either share power or step down peacefully.
Which provides a stark contrast to our next path. The negotiated revolutions were driven by foresight and compromise.
But the compelled revolutions,
They were driven by an unstoppable wave of popular defiance that simply overwhelmed the state apparatus.
and the epicenter of that wave was the German Democratic Republic, the GDR.
East Germany.
For a long time, the East German state projected a very convincing illusion of stability. Throughout the 1970s, they boasted full employment.
And we're actually producing a steady stream of consumer goods.
Because the Berlin Wall physically prevented mass emigration, a significant portion of the population just seemed to accept the reality of the regime.
But that acceptance was incredibly fragile. We can actually see the cracks forming in Source N.
The Stasi report.
Right. A highly classified secret police report from September 1987. What makes this document so critical is that the secret police are typically incentivized to tell the leadership that everything is under control.
Paint a rosy picture.
Exactly. But this report explicitly warns that workers are openly demanding solutions to worsening economic problems.
That they're completely indifferent to state propaganda.
And most dangerously, that they're openly glorifying the West after returning from approved family visits.
Let's focus on those visits, because that travel policy became the regime's Achilles heel.
We have Source O for this.
Yes, Source O is a statistical table that tracks these visits to the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. In 1985, there were roughly 66,000 approved visitors.
A controlled number.
But by 1988, that number had exploded to nearly 2.8 million.
What's fascinating here is the condition the state attached to that travel. To get a visa for a short visit to the West, an East German citizen usually had to leave a close family member behind in the East.
Effectively acting as a hostage to guarantee their return.
The state thought this secured their borders, but all it did was highlight the profound lack of freedom. You have almost 3 million people experiencing Western living standards, free speech, full grocery stores firsthand.
And then being forced back into a restrictive, struggling system.
The right to free travel became the catalyst for the terminal crisis of the GDR.
And the timeline of that terminal crisis plays out like a geopolitical thriller.
It really does.
Remember Hungary dismantling their border fence with Austria in May 1989.
A massive loophole.
East Germans quickly realized they didn't need a visa to travel to other communist states. So they utilized Hungary as that loophole. They traveled there on vacation and simply walked across the now open border into Austria.
And then on to West Germany.
In just 3 days in September, 18,000 East Germans escaped this way.
And others who couldn't get to Hungary began occupying the West German embassy in Prague.
The East German leader, Erich Honecker, was facing a public relations disaster right as the GDR was preparing to celebrate its 40th anniversary.
To clear the optics, he allowed the embassy occupiers to leave for the West.
But insisted they had to travel back through East German territory in locked, sealed trains.
It was a massive psychological blunder.
Huge. As those trains rolled through the GDR, tens of thousands of desperate citizens flocked to the stations.
Violently clashing with police as they tried to force their way onto the moving trains.
And at the exact same time, you have the famous Monday demonstrations gaining momentum in Leipzig. Week after week, the crowds grow larger, peacefully chanting, "We are the people."
The local police, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and lacking clear orders from a divided Politburo, refused to fire.
When Gorbachev visited East Berlin for the anniversary, he essentially told Honecker he was on his own.
Famously warning that life punishes latecomers.
Honecker was quickly ousted by his own party and replaced by Egon Krenz.
who attempted to offer minor travel concessions.
But by then, minor concessions were woefully insufficient. Which brings us to the monumental error on the night of November 9th, 1989.
The press conference.
The government had drafted a new regulation to grant exit visas more freely, hoping to release the pressure valve slowly, starting the next morning.
However, a party official announced it prematurely and incredibly confusingly during a live, televised press conference.
The moment that broadcast aired, tens of thousands of Berliners rushed directly to the border checkpoints.
The border guards were completely outnumbered.
Bewildered, unable to reach any senior officials for orders to use lethal force, they simply yielded.
They opened the barriers.
The Berlin Wall was breached by a sheer, peaceful mass of humanity.
It is arguably the defining image of the late 20th century, but it was far more than just a symbolic victory.
Let's look at Source P.
Right, it's a photograph of GDR military personnel physically demolishing sections of the wall with heavy machinery in February 1990.
The state itself was dismantling its defining structure.
This initiated a frantic, high-stakes diplomatic process known as the 2+4 talks,
Involving the two Germanys alongside the US, USSR, Britain, and France.
West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl managed a diplomatic masterpiece here. He secured full German reunification by October 1990.
He achieved this by overcoming British and French anxieties, and crucially, by securing Soviet agreement.
Through the promise of massive financial loans to help modernize the struggling Soviet economy.
All while ensuring the newly unified Germany remained a member of NATO.
A brilliant balancing act.
Now, the ripple effects of that open border in Berlin didn't stop at the edges of the GDR. It fundamentally destabilized the entire concept of the Iron Curtain.
Immediately triggering the compelled revolutions in Czechoslovakia and Romania.
Let's look at Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution first. Literally days after the Berlin Wall opens, an officially sanctioned student memorial in Prague transforms into an anti-government protest.
The police respond with violence, which severely backfires.
Within days, the protests snowball into a massive national strike, with crowds of up to 750,000 people flooding the capital.
The opposition quickly organized under a coalition called the Civic Forum, led by a playwright named Václav Havel.
Facing a general strike and realizing that the Soviets were not going to intervene, the communist government simply gave up.
They resigned in early December, and by the end of the year, Václav Havel was elected president.
It was an incredibly swift, remarkably nonviolent transition.
Hence the name, the Velvet Revolution.
It is a beautiful historical moment. But we have to draw a sharp, sobering contrast with Romania.
Yes.
The revolution there was anything but velvet. We have to ask, why did Romania erupt into a bloody conflict when Czechoslovakia managed a peaceful transition?
The answer lies entirely in the brutal nature of Nicolae Ceausescu's regime. Ceausescu had systematically impoverished his own nation to fund his grand ambitions.
To rapidly pay off heavy Western debts, he exported Romania's domestic food and fuel supplies,
intentionally causing severe domestic starvation and freezing conditions for his citizens.
While the population suffered, he was busy constructing a lavish 1,100-room palace in Bucharest.
And installing his extended family into every level of the government and military apparatus.
So when the revolutionary spark finally reached Romania, starting with protests in the city of Timișoara in mid-December, the regime's response was immediately lethal.
Unlike the hesitation we saw in East Germany, Ceausescu ordered his secret police to fire live ammunition into the crowds.
The protests only intensified, spreading to Bucharest.
Eventually, the regular army refused to continue firing on their own citizens and turned their weapons against the secret police.
Ceausescu and his wife attempted to flee by helicopter, but they were captured by the military.
Following a brief drumhead trial, they were executed by a firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989.
The power vacuum was quickly filled by a group called the National Salvation Front,
which, interestingly, was comprised largely of former second-tier communist officials who managed to secure power and eventually win democratic elections in May 1990.
The Romanian case proves a grim historical rule.
When a regime exercises absolute inflexibility, refuses any avenue for reform, and pushes its population to physical starvation, the eventual collapse will almost inevitably be violent.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost involved. And speaking of tragic ends, we must analyze Yugoslavia,
which represents our third and final path, nationalist fragmentation.
Now, Yugoslavia's historical trajectory was entirely unique within the region. They had successfully broken away from Soviet control way back in 1948 under the leadership of President Tito.
Because they weren't strictly behind the Iron Curtain, they enjoyed more contact with the West, slightly more cultural freedom, and access to Western credit.
But that credit eventually ran out. By 1989, the Yugoslav economy was in a catastrophic death spiral.
With inflation hitting a crippling 300%.
The state was a complex federation of distinct ethnic republics, and the only glue holding them together had been the overarching authority and personality of Tito.
But Tito had died in 1980, so by the late 80s, you have a fracturing bankrupt economy and a massive vacuum of national leadership.
And this is where the political dynamic shifts in a deeply sinister way.
Right.
In the other Soviet bloc countries we just analyzed, the population's anger was channeled into demands for democratic reform and the removal of the communist apparatus.
But in Yugoslavia, local political leaders within the various republics, such as Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, saw the collapse of communism sweeping Europe and realized the old ideology could no longer keep them in power.
Exactly. To maintain their grip on authority, these local leaders deliberately weaponized ethno-nationalism.
Instead of promising democratic freedom, they promised ethnic dominance and protection against neighboring republics.
The historical record points out a fatal structural flaw here.
When multi-party elections were finally introduced in 1990, they were organized solely at the state republic level, not at the federal level.
Which means there were no nationwide candidates campaigning on a platform of keeping Yugoslavia together.
Precisely. In that fractured, highly polarized climate, nationalist candidates swept the elections in almost every republic.
This outcome effectively doomed the Yugoslav Federation.
It led directly to individual states declaring independence, which the central Serbian-dominated military attempted to prevent by force.
This resulted in a brutal, multi-year descent into war.
The most devastating chapter was the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where an estimated 100,000 people were killed.
Millions were ethnically cleansed and displaced.
And entire cities were reduced to rubble.
It is a horrifying lesson in what happens when total economic collapse is exploited by opportunistic ethno-nationalist leaders.
It is absolutely harrowing history.
Before we conclude, we should briefly mention Albania, just to complete our geopolitical map.
Albania was perhaps the strictest, most isolated Stalinist state in Europe.
They were so rigid that they actually severed diplomatic ties with the USSR in the 1960s for being too reformist.
Because of their extreme isolation, heavily fortified borders, and lack of any organized opposition, they experienced a severely delayed reaction to the events of 1989.
It wasn't until the Albanian leadership witnessed the violent, televised execution of Ceausescu in Romania that they truly understood their vulnerability.
Spooked by the prospect of a similar fate, they slowly began to implement partial decentralization.
And eventually allowed multi-candidate elections, hoping to manage a soft landing.
This delayed process ultimately resulted in a non-communist government peacefully taking power by 1992.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize everything we've analyzed today, the paramount takeaway for your historical understanding is that the collapse of communism was not a monolith.
You can't write an essay claiming the wall fell and the entire region immediately embraced democracy.
Right. It was an incredibly complex web of events. It was triggered globally by Gorbachev's radical shift in Soviet foreign policy, which removed the threat of military intervention.
And it was accelerated locally by crushing economic ruin and massive foreign debt.
Crucially, for the IB student, the specific mechanics of how each state collapsed, whether it was peaceful or violent, a negotiated settlement, or a compelled surrender, depended entirely on the local ruling party's willingness to compromise.
And the unique historical and economic baggage of that specific country.
Demonstrating that level of nuanced differentiating between the mathematical precision of Poland's Round Table, the tragic violence of Romania, and the geopolitical maneuvering of West Germany's 2+4 diplomacy is exactly what elevates a standard historical summary into a top-tier analytical essay.
You have to constantly evaluate the intersecting roles of Soviet policy, domestic economic failure, and grassroots popular pressure.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Something we didn't explicitly debate today, but is hovering right beneath the surface of all these primary sources.
We talked extensively about massive debt, 200% price hikes, and severe consumer shortages.
If the Eastern Bloc economies hadn't been absolutely crippled by these economic failures,
If they had somehow managed to keep their populations well-fed and comfortable, Would the ideological desire for democratic freedom alone have been enough to spark these massive revolutions?
Or was it ultimately the reality of the empty grocery shelves that truly provided the force to tear down the Iron Curtain?
Something to think about as you review your notes. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep analyzing those sources.
And as always, keep questioning history.